Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and today we're taking a look at a very rare and very cool version of the Lee Enfield. This is a Latvian pattern carbine charger loading Lee Enfield Mark I Star, a type of rifle that was only made by the British as a full-length rifle, but was provided to Latvia in carbine form and has had a couple of cool modifications to it since. So we're going to take a look at those in a moment, but first let's go through a brief refresher on who was actually using this. Like, where did the Latvian army come from? Because up until the end of the First World War, Latvia, like the other Baltic states, was a part of the Russian Empire. It was a part of the empire that had a fairly strong interest, drive for autonomy, although not necessarily independence early on. But this got a bit radicalized during the First World War, and a Latvian independence movement really formed. Now, to back up for a moment, the Russian Empire, the Russian Army, Imperial Army, generally speaking, didn't have mono-ethnic units. They would bring together people from all parts of the empire into combined multi-ethnic military units. And this was done for a couple of reasons. One of them was to help prevent any sort of ethnic nationalism from taking hold, as well as, and this is something the British had to learn during World War I, if you have a single unit comprised entirely of people from the same place, it means in a war like World War I, you can have one really bad battle that results in all the young men from a particular area being essentially wiped out. The British started the war having some units like this to help with recruiting, and then discovered later on, like, ooh, that can have some really nasty repercussions, so they stopped doing it. Well, the Russians didn't do it from the very beginning, but they made an exception for the Latvians. As World War I progressed and there was a greater and greater need for more soldiers in the Russian Imperial Army, the Tsar made an exception and allowed the formation of a specifically Latvian division. These would become one of the Russian Army's more elite units. They're the Latvian riflemen, as they're known, and performed very well during World War I. When the Russian revolutions take place in 1917, everything, of course, politically in Russia falls apart, and that's when we see independence movements by all of the Baltic states. Latvia is no exception here. Latvia doesn't declare its independence until about a week after the armistice in 1918. They declare independence on November 18th, 1918. And at this point, things fragment out. The Latvian riflemen divide essentially into whites and reds, some fighting for national independence, some fighting to become the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic or a part of the Soviet Union. The Latvian independence war would last about 18 months. It's finally ultimately resolved with a peace treaty on August 11th, 1920. And that, of course, leads to the independent state of Latvia, and it needs an army, of course. Now, the Latvian army, as it's formed in the 1920s, consists of 5 divisions. It has 4 infantry divisions and 1 technical division that has some tanks and some airplanes and some stuff like that. And then they do also have 1 cavalry regiment. Now, Latvian armaments, like the rest of the Baltics, were composed of a lot of miscellaneous stuff that was left over and available at the end of the First World War. So just about everyone in this area had some Mosin-style. A lot of them had some Mausers. There were Arisakas floating around. Each country kind of has its own unique blend of surplus rifles that it would be equipped with. In Latvia, the predominant one was actually the British. It was, in fact, the pattern 1914 303 British Enfield. These come about not from actual wartime use, but because during Latvia's independence war, the nationalist forces are substantially supported by the British, especially the British Navy, and the British transfer something like 20,000 pattern 1914 Enfields to the Latvian army. At the end of World War I, of course, the British have, everyone on the winning side at least, has way more guns than they need. They're looking to get rid of some of the surplus. For the British, it is the Lee Enfields that are the guns that are standardized that they're going to keep. The pattern 1914s are a non-standard emergency wartime, secondary status rifle, and so those are the ones that they're most willing to give out to other countries, and Latvia is one of the major recipients of pattern 1914 rifles. So most of the Latvian infantry are equipped with P14s. The Latvian cavalry is looking for a shorter rifle, and sometime between 1920 and 1923, there is an order of between 2,200 and 2,350 Enfield carbines that Latvia places with BSA in England, and apparently what happens is BSA kind of puts together a bunch of surplus leftover guns and parts and stuff to assemble this order. They're happy to have the business. There aren't a lot of people paying for guns, at least not from private companies, in the early 1920s, so BSA is happy to do it. And this is the pattern of rifle that resulted. So used to equip the Latvian Cavalry regiment. So let's take a closer look at it, and I'll tell you where it came from, what it is, and what happened to it in Latvia over the 20 years until World War II. So what is this rifle? Well, it's a charger loading Lee Enfield, which means that it is an update of an early Lee Metford or Lee Enfield Mark I rifle. I actually have a full video on the British standard pattern of CLLE Mark I star, and I'll link to that in the description text here. But the short version is, if we take a look at the receiver here, these are the original manufacturing marks. This was originally produced as a long rifle, a Lee Enfield Mark I star long rifle by BSA in 1902. And it was then updated in 1910 by BSA to a charger loading Lee Enfield Mark I star. Now, the original British Lee Enfield rifles did not use stripper clips, or charger clips, as they call them. You actually had to load the magazine individually, one round at a time. In 1907, they introduced the SMLE, or it would become known as the SMLE. That's the iconic #1 Mark III Enfield rifle that we think of with World War I. That rifle introduced this bridge to use charger clips. So the British went back in, and between 1908 and 1913, they converted something like 300,000 of these older early pattern rifles to use the new charger clips. So the dust cover is gone, the bridge here is installed. We still have a magazine cutoff. This allows you to hold the magazine in reserve and just fire and single load cartridges. And then we also have the early style of safety located on the cocking knob here. So that's the early pattern safety. The standard SMLEs do not have it. They have a safety lever over here. Now, as originally produced, the CLLEs, like the Lee Enfield Mark I's, had full-length rifle barrels, but the Latvians didn't want that. They needed these as cavalry rifles, and so they had them procured, they had them put together by BSA with roughly 21-inch carbine barrels. So the standard CLLE that you see is longer. It has a central barrel band here, as well as this nose cap on the front. These rifles were originally set up to take pattern 1888 bayonets. This one doesn't quite, but it's really close. This also has a replacement barrel, and that may be the reason that it no longer really quite fits the bayonet, but I'm not 100% sure on that. This is the handguard from an original CLLE. The Latvians decided that they also wanted a front handguard. That's useful if you're doing some shooting and then you want to hold on to the gun up here for bayonet fighting. Now, on many of the surviving examples of these, the upper handguard is gone, but you can see the notches in wood here for the spring clips that would have originally held that handguard in place. So we see a similar thing on some other rifles like French RSC 1917s. It was just a clip-on handguard, and it's very easy to lose over time. This is the pattern of rear sight that was used on the CLLE. There were actually two versions, one for the Mark VI round, which was the original heavy round-nosed ball 303, one for the Mark VII, which was the then new Spitzer pointed bullet higher velocity cartridge. These guns are set up for the Spitzer Mark VII round, and you can tell that because the rear sight goes out to 1,900 yards. The ones that were for the older ammunition only went to 1,800 yards. Now the front sight here is fairly distinctive. This is an Enfield pattern 1914 front sight. When these guns were originally supplied to Latvia, they were supplied with standard CLLE charger loading Lee Enfield front sights. But it appears that at some point the Latvians replaced basically all of those front sights with pattern 1914 front sights. And I suppose that makes some sense because the majority of their other armed forces were using pattern 1914s. I'm not sure what exactly caused them to decide to replace the sights, but this is the natural thing to replace them with. Here on the receiver, we have the double British broad arrows that indicate that the rifle was sold out of service. This is what you would expect on a gun that was sold to a foreign country. It's no longer official government property of the United Kingdom. What's really cool about this one, though, is that it has this mark on the barrel. That's a T in a triangle in a circle, and that is the mark of Tikkakoski, the Finnish small arms company. So what we know from Tikka records, thanks to some really cool researchers on gunboards.com, is that in 1936, Tikka received one of these carbines from the Latvian military, along with a contract to manufacture 2,000 replacement barrels for them. Those completed barrels were delivered back to Latvia in 1937, and they were used by the Latvians to re-arsenal guns that had worn-out barrels. So this really does show us that these carbines remained in formal Latvian military use all the way through the late 1930s. Makes sense. They were good guns, they're nice little cavalry carbines. They just ended up with shot out or worn out or rusty barrels that needed replacement. So why not talk to someone local like Tikkakoski, get yourself some new barrels, and keep the guns in service. I also want to point out, originally the CLLEs all had long-range volley sights on them that consisted of a rear aperture that fit right here. There's a mounting point there, and a long stick with an aperture sight on it that fit into this cutout in the wood. That has been removed. On the original CLLE rifles, there would have been a dial front sight out here. Those were never in place. These have unique, these weren't made from full-length rifle stocks. These were made from leftover carbine stocks or new production stocks. I'm not sure exactly what BSA did there. One unusual element on this particular gun is the serial number on the bolt here. That's not standard British. It doesn't appear on all of the other surviving Latvian Enfield carbines, although it is on a couple of them. It might date to World War II usage by the Russians. It might be something totally unrelated, not sure. It's not the same as the serial number on the receiver, so it's not the original British serial number. Just pointing that out for sake of anyone else who might be looking at one of these guns. And then one other modification that's occasionally seen on these is adding of Russian-style sling slots to the stocks. So they don't replace the stocks with Russian stocks. It's the same buttstock, but they cut a slot in the stock with a pair of metal escutcheons on it, just like a Mosin-style. And you'll see them on the back and up here on the front of the gun. And you can see that on some surviving examples of the guns. You can also see it in some of the pictures, like period pictures from the interwar period and World War II of these rifles. So exactly when those sling conversions were done is not clear. Who did them isn't clear. There's not a lot of information about these Latvian Enfield carbines to begin with. When the Soviet Union occupied Latvia in 1940, the Latvian Army gave up without a fight, and a lot of these arms were incorporated into the Soviet military sphere. Now, these are far from standard arms, but of course, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union needs all the guns it can get. And so, reportedly, these saw some use as secondary arms. A non-trivial number of them were also kept by Latvians who went into the forest to fight as partisans against Soviet occupation. Latvia had a really unpleasant experience in World War II, being occupied by the Soviets and then the Germans, who they thought would be better than the Soviets but weren't, and then the Soviets again, and it was not a good story. So a fair number of these end up in the forest with forest brothers or partisans. Very few of them survive today. There's probably single-digit numbers of these here in the United States, and even single-digit numbers known worldwide. There's one of these at the VHU, that's the Czech Army Museum, in their storage collection. There's one of them, it's actually a cutaway, which is pretty cool, on display at the Latvian Army Museum in Riga. And then there are a couple in private hands. So I'd like to give a big thanks to Sam, the private collector, who loaned me this one to film for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.